Fancy seeing you here. I'm your host, Allie Ray, a serial entrepreneur and mom who loves building brands and raising babies. This is a podcast about being on brand and in season in every facet of your life. Each week, we dive into topics around business and brand development while sprinkling some hard-earned life lessons in there too. So if you love a good brand and a good breakdown, buckle up and come along with me as I sort of seamlessly switch between major life roles in an attempt to fulfill all the life dreams of a Type A Enneagram 3 millennial small business owner who wants to help other entrepreneurs and raise good humans. This is the Allie Ray Haney Show. Welcome back to another episode of the Allie Ray Haney Show. Today is an episode that's not directly related to branding and marketing. However, it is another facet of my life that we, use and work with every single day. And that is Airbnb. I don't know if you all knew this, but we are Airbnb hosts, Superhosts at that. And we have been since 2019. I believe now. November 2019 was when we hosted our first set of guests for Thanksgiving in North Carolina. So first I'm going to walk you through sort of our background as Airbnb hosts, how we came to be Airbnb hosts, and then we can get into a little bit more of like the fun stories. Hosting the public and seeing so many different families come through our short-term rentals. We've seen some things. So let's go back to the beginning. In 2018, my husband, Caleb, he received orders as an active duty Marine to move from North Carolina back to Quantico, which is in Northern Virginia. However, we owned our home in North Carolina, loved our home in North Carolina, and didn't want to sell it. So we thought, at that point, we thought maybe he would stay in the Marine Corps and we would end up coming back to North Carolina, and wanted to have the home to be able to move back into if/when that opportunity came about. When we moved, we put it up for as a long-term rental, and we signed it on with a property management company. We moved, I can't remember the exact day. It was early September. I was about 1 month away from being due with our first child. And as we left North Carolina and headed up to Virginia, Hurricane Florence was basically following us just one day behind. And our area was one of the areas that got hit the hardest by Hurricane Florence. Literally, once we got to Virginia, and I think it was even before we got our cable and internet hooked up, I was watching on Facebook all of the news coming out of this little town called Sneads Ferry, and legitimately the Weather Channel was showing the BP gas station by what we called the Shark Store. If you've ever lived in Sneads Ferry, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the top of the gas station was being ripped off, and that was 2 minutes from our house. So we were very fortunate in that hurricane to suffer very minor damage. We had just had a couple trees down, one fell on a part of our fence, but ultimately, we did not suffer throughout that hurricane. However, many of our neighbors, many in that community, not only in Sneads Ferry, but Eastern North Carolina as a whole, they experienced devastating loss. And so when we had signed on with that property management company, we just assumed that it would be another military family that would be moving in. However, that wasn't the case. So many families lost their homes during that time that people were needing, long-term rentals to be able to rebuild their homes. And so a local family that perhaps would not have typically rented out our house was renting out our house. And they were there for a year, and we suffered quite a bit of damages to our beloved first home. We had received throughout the year that they were renting multiple letters from the HOA saying they hadn't cut the grass all summer. They sent us a picture and the grass was above the 3-foot fence. It was just wild. But when they had moved out and we got back into the house, oh God, I might have to make a full full Instagram post on this, just the pictures of everything. There were holes in the walls. They had animals inside, obviously it was against their lease. When I say animals, I mean like a lot of animals, like feral cats, like my beloved bonus room studio that we had renovated that I used as my office and my photography studio. That was home to all of the feral cats. So there was still cat litter like all over that room. The refrigerator, I don't know if it just broke on its own or if they had happened to break it, but they never told us that it was broken. They never told the property management company that it was broken. So there was like black mold because they unplugged it and I guess bought a new refrigerator that they ended up taking with them. They stole our dryer and then left their dryer out in the backyard with a 3-foot grass. In fact, like the cats were such a thing. Like the cats were such a thing that under our front porch, there was just like this like little opening and there was this wicker basket that they had put out there to like house the feral cats. And so even after they moved out, we had come back to pull out the carpet upstairs and replace it all with laminate flooring, and because it was beyond saving. And they came back and put more cat food around the whole like perimeter of the property to continue to attract all of the cats. So cats are still there. We've sold the house at this point, but the cats are still there apparently, according to the neighbors that we're still in touch with, which is wild. And we sold the house in 2021. They were there in 2018-19, just to kind of give you a perspective of how many cats were there. It was wild. So anyway, all of that to say, we severed the contract with the property management company. Probably could have taken them to court, but I was tired and devastated and had a 1-year-old and I didn't know this at the time, about to be pregnant with a second. And I just didn't have it in me to fight that from 5 hours away because we were still living in Virginia. Still wanted to hold on to that house because I loved it so much, even after it had been through such a terrible, terrible experience. But that's when we visited the idea of it becoming an Airbnb. And I did not know anything about short-term rentals when we made that decision. It was really like a Hail Mary because I had such trust issues with property management companies at that point. So we, like I mentioned earlier, we renovated some of the areas of the house, renovated and repaired really. We had to obviously buy a new washer and dryer set, a new refrigerator. There were some major appliance purchases that we had to make. And then along with that, we then had to purchase, a whole house full of furniture because at an Airbnb, obviously people have to have a place to sleep, eat, plates to eat on, kitchenwares to use. And so that was just a whole learning curve. And then introduce, of course, the systems on the back end of the welcome guide and communicating with guests through the app and setting up the pricing structure for nights and holidays and weekends and all of the things. So our renters moved out in, I believe there's maybe supposed to be out October 1st. And I think it took them until the 9th to officially get out. And so mid-October was when we went down, and my family just rallied behind us and helped us do all of that work that needed to be done. My dad, my brother, they were there, blood, sweat, and tears, like laying flooring for us, throwing carpet out the top story window. It was just wild. So we got all of that done, and finally it was on Airbnb live in mid-November, and we actually got our first booking for Thanksgiving. And we told them, of course, like, this is our first time hosting, so please let us know if we're missing anything. And of course I was missing stuff. Apparently I didn't even put coffee mugs in there because I was more worried about like having pretty pillows on the couch. So We learned a lot through those first couple of months, and then COVID hit in March of 2020. That was a whole learning curve. Like, it was a learning curve on top of a learning curve. When COVID hit, we ended up shutting down the house completely, so we had no income coming from it for the months of April and May. And at that point, I guess it was very clear that no one was living there. However, it was also clear that it was furnished and it had TV and nice things like AC and heat. And someone ended up actually breaking into that house. And I don't know if they were squatting for a while, but there was definite evidence of people having been there. And so we had to navigate through that whole drama. They did end up stealing a TV and our entire closet full of wine that we had there for guests to lay out as a welcome gift. They also decided to make themselves some eggs and leave the pan under the couch. So that was interesting. We filed a police report, obviously never heard anything else about it, and then recovered from there. So after that, we were much better off. It was a much smoother transition, or not transition, but a smoother time after COVID and things started to open back up. I believe we opened the rental, I'm trying to think, I don't know exactly when, but it was probably summertime when we opened it back up after COVID under like the strict cleaning policies. And from that summer of 2020 until when we sold the property in September of 2021, during the summer we had an insanely high booking percentage rate. Granted, we were just, 5 minutes from the beach. So, and we were able to accommodate 10 guests in our 4-bedroom house. So, and we had it set up so perfectly for families that had kids, because the entire bonus room was 2 sets of bunk beds. It had a huge TV. Well, before it was stolen, it had a huge TV, as well as like a gaming system and DVD players. They were able to set up, we had a Netflix account that was specifically for that house. And so it was just really perfect for a set of 2 to 3 families that wanted to go and spend the week at a beach. The other really cool thing about that house, obviously, was that it was really close to the military base. So we had lots of military families come for many reasons, whether it was for the holidays to visit their loved one if their loved one couldn't leave base. It was for homecomings, like welcoming their Marines back from deployment. We hosted a couple of small like baby and bridal showers for people that were living in the area that were Marines. So it was just really cool to be part of some really awesome memories for people, especially in the military community where we were part of it. And so although there were their downsides, of course, that house held so much space and memory and just happiness for so many people, including us. Not to mention, it was really great to be able to block out dates and go stay near the beach whenever we wanted to. We didn't do it super often because, of course, like it was COVID times and we were mostly at our house anyway. Then we welcomed our second child in September of 2020. So the height of when people were visiting, we left those dates to the guests so that we could continue to make money. Like I mentioned, we sold the house in September 2021. That was right after Caleb got out of the Marine Corps. We realized we likely weren't going to be moving back to that area. And we had already purchased the property in Kentucky in August of 2021. That property in Kentucky, if you've been a long-time listener, you know that episode 3 is all about the property in Kentucky and how it was supposed to be a wedding venue. If you haven't given that episode a listen, that's also a very dramatic episode. So it's a good one to go listen to if you want the tea. But we sold that house in North Carolina to be able to put all of our funds towards this dream of having a wedding venue in Kentucky. Spoiler on that story, the wedding venue in Kentucky did not go as planned. However, it was turned into an Airbnb and is still functioning as an Airbnb today. So, I can rewind and tell you how the house in North Carolina sold. We actually sold it because it was an investment property as an Airbnb. So when we sold that house, we sold it from Kentucky, and we sold it completely furnished to a family who wanted to split their time between this community where I believe one of their children lived, and then the other half of the year they were going to Airbnb it out and live in their home state. I don't remember exactly where it was. But hindsight 2020, probably should have sold the LLC that was running the Airbnb along with the property, and obviously made it more expensive. However, that was a learning curve that I was not prepared to take at that time. And at that moment, my full attention was pretty much given to everything that was going on in Kentucky. So now transitioning over to our Airbnb in Kentucky, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of that story since there's a full episode on it from earlier. But we attempted to make that beautiful 90-acre property in Kentucky into a wedding venue with overnight accommodations for not only the bride and groom, but also the bridal party or their family and friends. It had a main house on it that is a 5-bedroom, 5.5 bath house that is close to 6,000 or just over 6,000 square feet. And then there was also a 2-bed, 1-bath guest house that was supposed to be the honeymoon suite for the bride and groom. We faced a lot of issues with the county and with our neighbors, and ultimately decided that it was not a great business decision to move forward as a wedding venue. However, the property was still well suited for an Airbnb or short-term rental. So we have since run that as an Airbnb. We are going on just over 2 years as an Airbnb there. That is right. Yes, because we started that Airbnb pretty much the same time I had our second son, our third and final child. So that has been going well. We've seen a lot of different renters there than the clientele that we had at the North Carolina house, which I think is really interesting. Like I mentioned, many of the guests in North Carolina were military affiliated simply because of the proximity to base that our house was. However, the guests that we typically see in Kentucky are older couples because each of the bedrooms has its own ensuite bathroom. We find that people love it, almost use it as okay, of course it's being used sort of as a hotel because it's an Airbnb, but every couple can have their own dedicated room and bathroom. So that gives it a little bit more of a vibe of privacy. And so we've found that a lot of the guests that we have are guests that have been lifelong friends from since high school, and they're coming for their annual trip to the Bourbon Trail. For those of you who don't know, the Kentucky House is in a tiny little town called Bloomfield, Kentucky, and it is right in the heart of the Bourbon Trail. We are about an hour outside of Louisville. We are about an hour outside of Lexington, but we are only about 25 minutes from Bardstown, Kentucky, which is the bourbon capital of the world. So when people come, 9.5 times out of 10, they are visiting to do Bourbon Trail tours. And so we try to do our best to tailor their guest experience to what we anticipate they're going to be there for. Now, I don't remember if I said this in the beginning of the episode, but we have hosted in 3 different states. So North Carolina being the first, Kentucky being the second, and Virginia being the third. I do not own the home in Virginia that I host, in quotation marks. It is actually owned by my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and it is in our hometown of Fluvanna County, Virginia. And I do all of their app communication through the Airbnb app. If you were to talk to my mother-in-law today, she would tell you absolutely not. I am not a tech person, but it's always been her dream to run a B&B. And they live on 15 acres in this beautiful 3-story home. They actually live in the basement, so that is also a different type of host experience. And they rent out the top 2 floors. The funny thing about that is that it's a different type of guest that they attract. They attract big families. Big families typically going to weddings. There is a local wedding venue in Central Virginia that they host weddings almost every single weekend right here in our hometown. And there are no really big Airbnbs. They have a max guest count of 12. There's no other Airbnb that can offer the amount of space in that proximity to this wedding venue. So this wedding venue keeps them pretty steady throughout the year, or at least the wedding season between April and September, October. And they are booked out. They have an incredible booking rate. Kentucky is kind of quiet sometimes. It's a very seasonal calendar, and it's also at a much higher price point. But the Virginia Airbnb, that thing is booked out every single weekend from pretty much the end of March until mid to end of November, right around Thanksgiving, every single weekend. And they love it. My mother-in-law loves it. They, like I said, they live on 15 acres. They have chickens, so they provide a, in quotation marks, farm stay for their guests. They provide fresh eggs if the guests would like them. They have a creek in their backyard that is a fan favorite of the kids. And she cleans her own Airbnb. And that's funny because that was a non-negotiable for me. It's like pulling teeth for me to clean my own house. So I'm certainly not cleaning an Airbnb. It does not bring me joy. I will pay somebody any day to do that for me. However, she's the exact opposite. She, no one else's standards are up to hers when it comes to the guests and where the guests are staying. So, yes, I do all of their online communication for them, and she does all of the in-person interaction if there ever is any. So now that you guys know sort of my background as an Airbnb host, I would love to share some stories with you of previous guests that we've had that just some of them just have me rolling. So when we were cleaning up the house in North Carolina after the long-term renters moved out, we brought just a ton of cleaning supplies. We were anticipating that it wasn't going to be in the condition that we left it in. So we came prepared. And when I came, I brought the Roomba, we call her Rhonda. It's like the robot vacuum. And I left it down there so that if the guests needed it, they could just hit the button and let it clean up the mess for them. Especially because we were so close to the beach, we ended up having a lot of sand tracked in and out. That was an issue almost with the drains in the bathrooms. So I was like, okay, if they're tracking sand in and out, I would love for them to just be able to hit the button on Rhonda and tell her to go. So I did not remember that Caleb had set a timer at our house to go off at 2 a.m. every morning and then automatically go back to the charging station. So one of the very first guests that checked into North Carolina asked us if the house was haunted or if we had ever felt a presence, because every morning that they stayed there at 2 a.m., she would hear this sound that sounded almost like a cup of coffee was brewing. And I was just racking my brain. Like, I lived there for 3 years. Caleb had gone on 2 6-month deployments. So I lived in that house by myself for a minimum of one of the 3 years that we lived there. And I was like, I don't know that I'm super in tune with anything supernatural, but I never felt a presence there, ever. And so I was like racking my brain, what in the world could this have been? And finally, when I told Caleb about the story, he was like, I never took the timer off of Rhonda, and she's been just knocking walls and furniture every night, regardless of whether or not we were there. And I'm like, I'm mostly just impressed that Rhonda made it back to the charging station every night, because we had issues with that at our house. So anyway, that was one of the craziest stories that we had. And that was one of the, or not, maybe not craziest, but that was one of the funniest stories that we had. And that happened like right off the bat. Another story that happened in North Carolina was we had an inquiry for a show to be filmed at our house. And it was like a Dateline, not like Dateline, like murder Dateline, but like Dateline, like informational, I guess, almost like PBS. I don't know. It never actually happened, so I didn't get a ton of details on it. However, I thought that was an interesting request. Look, there's nothing more on brand or in season than confidence. Whether you're an entrepreneur or a mom, in a time of imposter syndrome and constant comparison, we could all use a little bit more confidence. And that's what Created Colorful gave me. Created Colorful is a virtual color analysis where you are given your knockout color palette for guaranteed constant confidence. Imagine going into a store and knowing exactly what to pick out to make you look your best at all times. That's what Created Colorful gave me after a bout with postpartum depression, as well as an isolating entrepreneurial endeavor. So if you would like a quick confidence boost, use code AllieRay for $15 off your Created Colorful virtual color analysis. You can book that analysis at createdcolorful.com/virtual color analysis. Use code AllieRay, that's ALIRAE, at checkout for $15 off your consult and be one step closer to the confidence you crave. One of my favorite things about hosting is when you get repeat guests. So at the Kentucky house, we have now one group of friends that comes back with their motorcycles every year, and they love the Airbnb because we have a 2-car garage and they can park all of their, I think it's 4 or 5 motorcycles in the 2-car garage in case it rains. And so they come every year for their annual friend trip. We have the Bourbon Festival, I think it's every September. And one year we actually had somebody that, when you, as a host on Airbnb, you can see sometimes where the individual that is renting the house is from. And it said Charlottesville, Virginia. And I was like, what in the world? Do I know these people? And so I, messaged them back and I said, hey, I see you're from Charlottesville. You have the same area code as me and everything. What brings you here this weekend? And they owned a flooring company in Charlottesville, and they had repurposed some wild turkey bourbon barrels into wooden floors. And they were selling those wooden floors, or those planks, I guess, at the Bourbon Festival. And I was like, wow, what a small world. We move away from our hometown and still find people from our hometown coming to enjoy the bourbon country. The Virginia house, my mother-in-law's house, she has a family that comes every year for a family reunion of sorts, but it's a mini family reunion. So apparently this family had always gone to Richmond in the past because they would spend 3 days at King's Dominion, which, if you're not from where we are, it's an amusement park, like Cedar Point, or Six Flags, I guess, is more nationally known. It's sort of like that, but on a little bit of a smaller scale. And then I guess the house that they were renting in Richmond, it stopped being a short-term rental. So they then found my mother-in-law's house because, like I said, that's not a common thing to have a high guest count like they have. And so they had planned, we're going to make the trek to King's Dominion because Richmond's probably like 20 minutes from King's Dominion versus where they live is like an hour and 20 minutes from King's Dominion. But the best part about this story is that they came and they ended up not going to King's Dominion at all. They went to like Dollar General and bought a bunch of like slip and slides and Nerf guns and like yard toys and things. And they stayed there the entire time, like the whole like 5 days or whatever they rented out for, because they just enjoyed each other's company and they finally had a space that allowed them to be able to spread out and have fun and catch up. And it was really cool. They're actually coming for their 3rd year in a row this month, which is really wild and really awesome. And of course with every fun story, there's not every fun story. With every 5 fun stories, there's one that's like, eh. And one of the ones that's like, eh, that happened at my mother-in-law's house it was a bachelorette party. And, I do my best to vet the guests before they come. We do not have instant book on for any of the properties unless they have like a certain amount of 5-star reviews. And quite frankly, I don't remember if this particular guest was an instant book guest or not, but they were relatively tame night 1. However, night 2, they apparently let loose. I think they had gone winery hopping, which is also a very common pastime for people that come to the Virginia house. We live in, I've said it like 6 times now, Central Virginia, and although it's not like, Napa Valley, California, we are known for the wine in this area. It's like a whole wine trail. And so they had come back from their day drinking of wine and continued the party in the hot tub on the back porch. Well, my mother-in-law they live downstairs in the basement, and you won't interact with guests unless the guests want to be interacted with. And they're like, we never hear anything. Like, we can sometimes hear footsteps, like, right by the door that leads down to the basement. But, like, 9 times out of 10, we don't really hear much. It's not like we can hear their conversations or anything. And so she was, like, alarmed by the volume of this woman out on the back porch, like, screaming. And I was like, there's no way that this is, like, this loud, because the person who messaged me, I believe, was the bride through the app, and I knew like her mom was coming with them, and I'm like, oh, if mom's there, like nothing crazy is gonna happen. Apparently these 2 girls got in a fight. I think it was the bride and a bridesmaid. Needless to say, the bridesmaid was not any longer in the wedding after this. But the mom had already gone to sleep, and the mom just like woke up from dead sleep and was like, you need to get the F out. And so the bridesmaid left in the middle of the night. And I was like, oh, Lord. My mother-in-law didn't tell me any of this until afterwards. And I'm like, I already left them a good review. But yeah, we've seen so many funny stories as hosts of an Airbnb. I'm very proud to say that we have retained our Superhost status for almost a full consecutive 5 years. The only time we lost Superhost status was when we sold the house in North Carolina, because I had bookings open for 6 months out, and we sold the house so quickly that there were multiple bookings I had to cancel because the new owners of the house were planning on being there during the time that those bookings had already taken place, or were supposed to take place. So that's when we lost our Superhost status for a short amount of time in between the North Carolina house and the Kentucky house. However, we are steady 5-star reviews at the Kentucky Airbnb and 4.9 at the Virginia Airbnb. I don't remember what our average was in North Carolina, but in order to maintain your Superhost status, I think it has to be 4.8 or higher, something like that. And the final thing that I want to touch on is that we are not just Airbnb hosts. We use Airbnb all of the time. Specifically this year, we have used it a ton as we were visiting different cities in North Carolina to figure out where we want to have our next chapter. And so we've been in Airbnbs all across the United States, in Florida, in South Carolina, in Kentucky, Tennessee. Whenever I shoot a wedding, or a destination wedding, I don't do that much anymore. But anytime that we did, we always stayed in an Airbnb. And what I love the most about Airbnbs is that it can be an experience. Of course, there are going to be some bad ones, but I like to think that I'm pretty good at looking and sifting through the listings to know what's going to be good and what's going to be bad and avoid those bad ones. But it's just a really cool experience to be able to show my kids or my family like a different way of traveling. And I will say that some of the best things that I notice about other Airbnbs is that they know the type of guest that's going to come stay there with them, and they cater to that guest. So, for example, Caleb and I went to a weekend in Nashville for President's Day one year. It was like February. And we stayed in this, like, it wasn't quite downtown, but it was close to Broadway. And it was perfect for 2 people. They had waters in their refrigerator. They had guides for local Nashville attractions and restaurants. They knew who was going to be coming to visit the area and the type of people or the type of guests that were going to be staying there. They were there to have a good time. It wasn't going to be a family that was coming to stay in this 1-bedroom studio apartment. Versus we went to a home in Wake Forest that was a little bit more, it wasn't off the beaten path. It was still maybe like, 5 or 6 cross streets out from downtown, but it had a fenced in area so that the kids could go play in the backyard. It had a crib that was waiting there for us. It had kids' toys so that the kids could occupy themselves. Like, anytime you think about the ideal client, see, I guess I did bring it back around to branding and marketing. The ideal client or the ideal guest that's going to come and visit there, that's what differentiates an Airbnb guest experience. So one of my goals actually for the Kentucky house is to eventually leave a bottle of bourbon there for them because, like I said, 9.5 times out of 10, they're coming to visit the Bourbon Trail. And it's just really nice to have the experience catered to meet the needs of the people of you as the guest. So the better you know the ideal guest that you want to attract, the better you can cater to their needs, and the more likely they're going to give you a positive review, hopefully 5 stars, and return again, recommend your rental to their friends. Wrapping it up, after, I feel like since I brought it back around to branding and marketing, like I just need to wrap it up in a bow and go from there. Until next time, friends, keep dreaming, keep creating, and remember, your brand is your story. Let's tell it together. As my son would say, did it! You just completed another episode of the Allie Ray Haney Show. If you found this helpful, please rate, review, and subscribe to help others find this show and so you never miss an episode. Take a look at the show notes for all the resources mentioned in today's episode. Let's continue the conversation over in my private Facebook group, the Allie Ray Haney Show Insiders. See you next Wednesday, and as always, I'm here cheering you on as you build your dream brand and business.